I've been working on the project. I've been working on the project since 2016 when we started developing the project, and the project was officially launched in 2017. So this talk will be a sort of brief look at the history of the Great North Wood, a look at some of the wildlife that we find in the Great North Wood, and then we'll also talk about the project and what kind of things we're up to, and what we've been up to for the last 4 years or so. So many of you may well be familiar with the Great North Wood, but for those that aren't, by way of introduction, here's a map of what we think the Great North Wood would have looked like in the 16th century. So it was a large wooded landscape which spanned from Deptford in the north down to Selhurst in the south, from Streatham in the west over to what we now call Crystal Palace Park in the east. But before we delve much further into the history of the Great North Wood, I want to sort of zoom out a bit and zoom back in time 12,000 years to the end of the last ice age, which is when woodland history kind of begins in the UK. So during the ice age, it was too cold for trees to really become established in the UK. Permafrost spread across the whole country, and it was scoured by glaciers. So there was not really any trees, maybe some low scrub. And then as temperatures began to warm about 12,000 years ago, conditions became more hospitable to trees. So during the Ice Age, and a little bit after, the UK was actually connected to Europe by a land bridge. So because so much water was locked up in the ice caps, the sea levels were much lower than they are, and that meant that we were connected to mainland Europe via Doggerland, as it was known. So as temperatures began to warm, trees were able to actually colonize from mainland Europe along that land bridge. But as temperatures warmed, the sea levels rose as the ice caps melted, and that land bridge was cut off. So there was quite a narrow window in time when trees were actually able to colonize the UK. And that is why we have actually a relatively small number of species. So those species that managed to get across in that brief window of geological time are the ones that we consider to be our native tree species. And we have about 30 to 40 of those, depending on how you count them. Some you might count as shrubs. There's some controversy about what kind of vegetation may have developed in the UK before humans really got involved and started manipulating it and changing it in a big way. So the historical view is that the UK was covered in dense, dark woodland. This is the idea of the wild wood. So the idea that a squirrel could travel from John O'Groats to Land's End without touching the ground, that there was just dense, dark forest. That view was challenged in the sort of late 90s by a scientist called Franz Vera, who came up with quite a different idea of what vegetation might have looked like in sort of Northwest Europe. And he proposed that, in fact, the action of large grazing mammals would have kept much more open areas. So there would have been a sort of complex matrix of grassland, scrub and trees with areas of woodland, but not a kind of homogeneous woodland. So this picture here is the Net Wildland, which is a rewilding project in Sussex. And what they've done there is they've turned what was farmland into a kind of rewilding project. They've reintroduced these large mammals. So these here are longhorn, English longhorn cattle. They've also introduced red deer, Tamworth pigs, and Exmoor ponies. And those all kind of mimic in some way the sort of the primitive, or rather the primeval creatures that roamed the UK in the distant past. And what they found is that the action of those grazing and browsing mammals together creates this quite complex habitat of grassland, scrub and woodland. And lots of species have returned to the Net Wildland that elsewhere are in quite precipitous decline. So it's been a really interesting and successful project. Those English longhorn cattle, to some extent, mimic the aurochs, which is the primeval cow that would have that is the descendant of modern cows, and would have potentially have created this more open habitat. So humans didn't really have a big impact in woodland until around 4,000 years ago, when the Neolithic people developed agriculture and tools which enabled them to start to cut down trees and clear vegetation. They also hunted many of those large mammals to extinction. And the ones they didn't kill, they domesticated and then cleared land for them for their pasturage. So yeah, humans quite quickly started to change the landscape. If we fast forward to the Middle Ages, at this point there's about 15% woodland cover, and those woodlands at that time would have been intensively managed for woodland products. And we know that because the Domesday Book, which is a kind of very detailed survey of woodlands across the UK, well, of all types of land use, but it indicates that there was about 15% woodland. And there's also an early mention of the Great North Wood in the Domesday Book. So it doesn't call it the Great North Wood. That's a sort of more modern name for the area, but it describes an area of woodland in what we now think of as the Great North Wood, and it describes it as woodland for 200 swine. So the Domesday Book doesn't record the sort of area of the woodland; it records the number of pigs that could be kind of accommodated in a particular woodland. So here's an image of some men beating the acorns out of some oak trees for their pigs to eat, and this practice was called pannage, the practice of herding pigs rather through woodland to fatten them up on the acorns. So at this point, although this is a map of what we think the Great North would have looked like in the 16th century, going back to the Middle Ages, it probably would have looked fairly similar. It would have been a mixture of coppice woodland and wood commons, which would have been more open, sort of grassy landscapes with scattered trees. And the woodland sits on top of this ridge, and that's part of the reason why it was able to persist as woodland for so many centuries, is because it was this very sort of dense, wet clay ridge, so it wasn't very suitable for agriculture. But the other reason why it was able to persist for so long was because it was intensively managed and incredibly important economically. So charcoal burning was one of the key industries supported by the Great North Wood. This image is a photo taken in 1910 of some colliers in Epping Forest, and they would build these temporary huts to sort of spend the winter in when they would harvest their timber. So the way they would make charcoal was to collect wood, harvest the wood, and pile it up into these quite elaborate structures. They then cover that with earth and burn it very slowly over a period of several days to create the charcoal. So one of the key canopy species in the Great North Wood is hornbeam, which is this tree here that Chantal memorably described as like a McCoy's crisp, crinkle cut. So hornbeam was one of the trees that would have been used to make charcoal. It has a very dense timber and it makes good quality charcoal. The other, perhaps even more dominant tree in the Great North Wood is the sessile oak, which is one of the two native oak species. And it has very tall, straight timbers, taller and straighter, in fact, than the English oak, which is the other native species. And it's that property which is, we think, maybe why it's so dominant in the Great North Wood, as over many centuries, this tree with its big, long, straight timbers would have been selected for. We also find English oak in the Great North Wood, and these tend to have a more open and sinuous structure, although it does depend on sort of how open the environment is that they've been growing. This is perhaps one of the biggest oak trees in the Great North Wood area in Sparwood. Another key industry supported by the wood was shipbuilding. So timbers would have been collected from the wood and taken to Deptford, where the centre of the shipbuilding industry was taking place in the UK. This is a picture of the Golden Hind, which was allegedly constructed from timbers from the Great Stake Pit Coppice, which is now Convent Wood. And this is the ship that Francis Drake famously circumnavigated the globe in. Another industry that was very important in the Great Northwood was oak bark, the harvesting of oak bark, which was then used in the tanning industry. So it was used for leather making. Oak bark is very rich in tannins, so that's a chemical which helps to preserve leather. And that industry was concentrated in Bermondsey. So these different types of products would have been collected and harvested from the wood using a system known as coppice with standards. So coppicing is when you cut down a tree at the base and it resprouts, and then after a given amount of time, you then reharvest those poles that have resulted from you cutting it down. And you can do that sort of ad infinitum. So you do it on a cyclical rotation and you get a sustainable supply of wood. But in order to get the big timbers needed for shipbuilding and also house building, you'd have these standard trees. So you can see in this photo, some of the trees have been allowed to grow sort of up to full size. And for oak, they would be harvested at about 80 years. And then other trees have been coppiced, so they've been cut down, and you can see here's probably 2 or 3 years growth from those trees that have been coppiced. And oak and hornbeam were probably coppiced on a sort of 7 to 10 year rotation. So you can see sort of the woods would have been a lot more open than we see them today, and so sort of how we imagine a classic woodland should look. And that has implications for the sort of habitat of the woodlands. Aside from the industry that took place in the wood, the woods were also sort of a great tourist attraction, particularly the mineral wells which you find across the whole area. So there were wells at Sydenham and at Streatham. One of the most famous wells was at Beulah Spa, which is now Spa Wood. And this was a very famous sort of Victorian pleasure garden. It had a dancing lawn and rose gardens and mazes and camera obscura. The Queen Victoria visited a few times and Charles Dickens came along. And this was actually the site where we held our Great Northwood Festival in September last year. The Great Northwood has also been a sort of place of refuge for people. So one of the most famous characters of the Great Northwood is Margaret Finch, who was known as the Queen of the Gypsies. And she allegedly lived in a conical hut at the base of an ancient oak tree in what we now know as Gypsy Hill. And she was a famed fortune teller. So Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist, writes that his wife went to visit the gypsies at Lambeth to have her fortune told. And that could have been Margaret Finch, because Samuel Pepys was writing at a time that she would have lived. Apparently she lived to the ripe old age of 108 from 1632 to 1740. And Samuel Matthews, or also known as the Hairy Man, Samuel Matthews, the Hairy Man of Dulwich, who lived in Dulwich Woods in a depression that he dug in the ground for himself, or some sort of cave that he'd hollowed out. And he was a kind of jobbing gardener and a local sort of character, quite well known in the community, but he was sadly murdered in 1802 in sort of mysterious circumstances. But these sort of traditional industries and traditional ways of life started to change in the 1700s when with the onset of the Industrial Revolution. So those industries I talked about began to change. So charcoal was superseded by coal. ships were built from steel rather than oak, and the tannin in oak bark was replaced by chemicals. So those industries declined quite quickly, and those industries, although they sort of used the wood, they were also responsible for it to be sustained. So they sustained it as well as harvested resources from it. Another key sort of historical event in the Great North Wood, and well, a key historical event for lots of reasons, were the Enclosure Acts, which took place in the sort of late 1700s and early 1800s. This is the enclosure map of Croydon, and the Enclosure Acts basically allowed areas of land to be parcelled off, and the commoners' rights, so the right for local people to graze their cattle or harvest firewood, were extinguished, and landowners could then sell off the land to whoever they liked. So this map is from 1801, I think, and it shows Biggin Wood here. These are these are the coppices of Biggin Hill, which are no longer there. This is the site of Sparwood, which soon after this map was created and the Enclosure Act happened, was sold off to someone called John Cater, who then created Beulah Spa, turned it into a kind of pleasure garden. There's a sort of bit of comic verse from the time that says, "The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose off the common, but leaves the greater villain loose who steals the common from the goose." Another key event in the history of the Great North Wood was the coming of the Crystal Palace to the area. So it was originally constructed in Hyde Park to house the Great Exhibition, and then it moved to what was then called Penge Place, but had until recently been Penge Common. So with the coming of the Crystal Palace, the area it kind of put the area on the map, and it went from being a sort of rural backwater to suddenly this place where people wanted to move. So it started to sort of draw down development from central London. And then with the coming of the railways, that kind of hastened that process. So the canals, which were quickly superseded by the railways, allowed transport into the area and continued to drag that development southward. So this is a painting by Camille Pizarro from 1871, and it's actually painted from the railway bridge in Sydenham Hill Wood, looking northwards towards Nunhead, and this railway line connected Nunhead to the Crystal Palace. So here we've got what we think it would have looked like, what we think the wood would have been like in the 16th century, and here we've got what its current extent. So by the sort of late 1800s, most of the woodland had been lost, and we're left with this kind of scattering of fragments. So it would have originally been cleared to make way for farmland and then to make way for housing. And the bits that we've got left tended to sort of survive in the grounds and the gardens of Victorian houses and estates, and then have subsequently come back into public ownership sort of at the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 19th century, or sorry, the 20th century, when local councils started to buy back land and create public parks. So London Wildlife Trust got involved with the Great North Wood very early on in its own history. So we came into being in the early 80s and quite quickly became involved in a campaign to save the woods. So there was a plan to build on part of Sydenham Hill Wood by Southwark Council, and London Wildlife Trust sort of spearheaded a local campaign, worked with other local campaigners to prevent that development from happening. And then since that time, we were successful in preventing that development, and since then we've managed Sydenham Hill Wood as a nature reserve. And there's been a sort of long-held desire to expand the work that we've done at Sydenham Hill Wood into some other areas of the Great North Wood. So in 2017, we officially launched the Great North Wood Project, which is largely funded by National Lottery Heritage Fund, with additional funding from Dulwich Estate and the Dulwich Society, from Veolia and the Mayor of London. And we picked 13 key sites from across the Great Northwood area. So we've got New Crossgate Cutting in the north, which is one of our nature reserves along the railway sidings. It's actually recent woodland. So this was part of the Great Northwood, but it was cleared and then subsequently is returned to woodland. Similarly, that's the case for One Tree Hill. Dulwich and Sydenham Hill Woods is the largest remaining fragment of ancient woodland, which goes back to the sort of original history of the Great Northwood. We've got Hillcrest Estate Wood, which is a sort of small fragment of woodland around a housing estate. Crystal Palace Park. There's Convent Wood, which is in the grounds of a Catholic school, so not publicly accessible, that one, but a very interesting site. We've got Streatham Common Woodlands, again, those are recent woodlands. And then some of these sites in Croydon, so Biggin Wood, Spa Wood, where the Beulah Spa was situated, Beulah Heights, Grangewood Park, and the most southerly site is Long Lane Wood. And this kind of hazy green area gives you some indication of the original extent of the Great Northwood, although I think in this case it's been slightly exaggerated, so maybe a bit liberal there. But despite having lost so much of the wood, there's still like an incredible community of wildlife that lives in the Great Northwood. So just run through some of the things you can find in the Great Northwood. So in terms of fungi, we have, this is a fungi called panther cap. It's related to fly agaric, which is the bright red one, but this one's a bit of a duller red. And it's in the group of fungi that are mycorrhizal, so that means that they interact with plant roots, and there's a symbiotic relationship between the fungi and the plant, in this case trees, but actually sort of 95% of all plants have some kind of interaction with, have this symbiotic interaction with fungi. So the fungi has a kind of very fine network of threads which massively extends the surface area of the plant roots and allows the plant to absorb a lot more nutrients and water than it would ordinarily be able to. And in return, the plant releases lots of sugar down into the fungal network. So fungi are not able to produce sugar through photosynthesis in the way that plants are. And this is really, really important for the functioning of woodland ecology. So you get interactions, for example, where young trees that are growing underneath a dense canopy of woodland aren't able to do much photosynthesis because there's not that much light coming down to them, but they're able to make use of the sugars that are produced by their sort of parent trees, and they get that via the fungal network, which allows them to grow up eventually into the canopy. This fungus here on the top right is called jelly ear. It looks very much like an ear, and it grows on elder, most often on dead elder. This one is scarlet elf cup, and it specializes on growing on partially buried bits of wood. And this one is chicken of the woods on the bottom right, which is tends to grow on oak, and it is a sort of wood rotter. So it can grow on dead wood, but it can also grow on living trees. And this one's edible. And it's called chicken of the woods because it has a texture quite like chicken, kind of fibrous. Here are some of the birds that live in the Great Northwood. So we've got a sparrowhawk chick here. This is in Sydenham Hill Wood in the cedar of Lebanon. Let's go back there. These are some kestrel chicks, and the kestrels nest most years in the church tower, just alongside Cox's Walk, which is near Sydenham Hill Wood. And then we've got this woodpecker in the bottom right, great spotted woodpecker, feeding one of its chicks in a hole there. That's at Grangewood Park. There's also some fantastic insects in the Great Northwood. So this butterfly is the purple hair streak butterfly, which is quite an elusive butterfly and one that is sort of not necessarily that well known or that well recorded. And that's because it flies for a very short time in summer, and it flies in the evening, and it also flies high up in the canopy of the oak trees, where it feeds on honeydew secreted by aphids that are feeding on the oak leaves. It also has a life cycle that's sort of entirely dependent on oak, because the larvae feed on oak leaves, and it's the only UK species that's the case, or butterfly species, I should say. Then there's the stag beetle, very impressive looking insect, which is the largest terrestrial insect in the UK, and it requires rotting timber to complete its life cycle. So the larvae can take up to 7 years living in rotten wood, slowly growing before they emerge as these adults, which live for just a few weeks. And the adults actually aren't really able to eat, so they only live for a few weeks, they mate, and then they die. And this beetle in the bottom right is a wasp mimic beetle, and it's quite strikingly similar to a wasp when you see it in real life, because it moves in this very kind of wasp-like and erratic way. Here are some of the mammals that we find in the Great North Wood. So we've got a pipistrelle bat here. So every year we check the bat boxes at Sydenham Hill Wood and see what's roosting in them. There's a baby fox here that a photographer took at New Cross Gate Cutting. And here we have a hedgehog. So hedgehogs have declined quite dramatically across the UK, but there's still a few populations holding on the Great North Wood. We find them in places like Grangewood Park and Sydenham Hill Wood. We've got some as well, and probably some other of the sites. And then in terms of plants, there's of course these incredible veteran oak trees, like this one on the left. We have bluebell and wood anemone, which are ancient woodland indicator plants, which means that if you find them in great numbers in woodland, it's evidence that that woodland is ancient. And these plants take a really long time to colonize a woodland, and they take a really long time to spread. So if you have these big carpets of bluebells, you know that you've got a woodland which is many centuries old. So coming on now to some of the actions that we've been taking in the Great North Wood through the Great North Wood project, and some of the issues which we've sort of been trying to address. So this is a photo of Biggin Wood, and you can see that there's very little in the way of understory or ground floor here. In fact, there's just not really any at all. And that's because this area is quite heavily trampled. And it's also potentially because we've got a very kind of closed canopy of quite even-aged oak trees. So there's not a lot of light coming down to the woodland floor to sort of promote any creation of ground flora or regeneration of trees. So what we did here was created a big fenced area, and then we coppiced several trees within that area. So sort of returning to some of that traditional way of managing the woods. So you can see here the fence line, which is this big circle which encloses the coppiced area. And we hope that you can see also here on the right, there's a big hole in the canopy now where we've taken those trees down. So we hope that in combination, the light coming down to the woodland floor and the exclusion of people will allow regeneration of a ground flora and some understory there. So you can see here, this is a photo from earlier this year, where you can see that this oak stump is regenerating really well. It's got lots of new shoots coming back, and you can also see there's the beginnings of ground flora and understory here. I think in the next photo, yeah, you can see a big patch of bluebells, which was there originally, but it's kind of really flourishing now that it's not getting stepped on all the time. So if we just go back to that original photo, I mean, it's a pretty kind of ecologically poor state where you've just got trees and nothing else. And there's also potentially an issue there with the continuation of those trees. So if you've got people trampling the whole time, if those trees start to die, which is potentially exacerbated by the compaction that you've got with trampling, there's not going to be a new generation of trees. There's not going to be an understory where you've got young trees ready to take advantage of new light. So by reducing trampling, we're hoping to return some of that more complex habitat. Another issue in the Great North Wood is that we have these invasive species. So I mentioned that a lot of the woods sort of became part of Victorian gardens at one point, and what the legacy of that is that we've got lots of plants that have been introduced. So one of the key problematic species in the Great North Wood is cherry laurel. This is one of the biggest cherry laurels that we've ever found in the Great North Wood. And it's a species that casts a very dense shade, so it's evergreen, and it casts a shade all year round, which means that nothing else can really grow beneath it. It also, we think, releases cyanide from its leaves when it rains, that sort of leach into the soil and again kill plants around it, so that it's able to compete really, really effectively. So we've removed huge amounts of cherry laurel from the Great North Wood area. And where we've removed it, we've already started to see in these areas that light is again able to reach the woodland floor. We've seen carpets of new oak seedlings. And we hope that at least some of those oak seedlings might succeed in becoming oak trees. So the sort of interventions we make potentially have ramifications which last many centuries in terms of creating a new generation of oak trees which could themselves live for many centuries. Another thing we've been doing is creating infrastructure works in the woods. So we've been creating steps and boardwalks and new paths. And these allow greater access to the woods. So they, particularly for people that might have mobility issues. So it's really, it's a big part of our job to try and allow people to be able to experience the woods. But they also potentially control or at least guide people to use the woods in a particular way, so they're not spreading out across the whole woods, they're keeping to these paths. And if we have properly surfaced paths, then we find that they don't get so muddy in winter, and people don't tend to, so when you have a situation where there's a very muddy path, people tend to sort of walk to one side of it to find a dry spot, and then that bit gets muddy, so they walk to the side of that, and before too long you've got these big expanses of mud opening up, which are compacted, which are trampled, and where you can't get plants or new trees growing. Another problem we find in the woods is sort of as a result of their historical neglect is huge amounts of rubbish and fly tipping. So we've removed tons and tons of rubbish from all sorts of areas in the woods. And that sort of brings me on to our sort of community engagement aspect of the project, which is about allowing people to remember that these woods are valuable and remember that they're all part once of a whole, to teach people about woodland wildlife and to hopefully allow them to value these woods a bit more and not treat them so badly. So these are some of the activities we've been doing through our community engagement program. We do family learning sessions where we invite families with young children to come and do wildlife activities in the woods. So this is some kids doing some bug hunting in One Tree Hill. We have school sessions as well, so bringing school classes into the woods to do activities. We've been working with young people as well, so this is a group of young people in the bottom right here, from an organisation called The Challenge, and this is where we removed big quantities of green waste from one of the woods. We've done some guided walks. Well, I've done lots of guided walks. This is one of our guided walks that went through Biggin Wood. It was one of our Great North Wood walks where we walked through several of the Great North Wood sites to allow people to kind of see how they linked up in the landscape. And then on the right here, this is a picture of us doing some tree surveying. So the surveying aspect of the project is really important to sort of find out what wildlife we have, And one of the big surveys we've been doing is of the ancient and veteran trees. So we sort of measure them up and take photographs of them and log them on the ancient tree inventory, which is a database of ancient trees across the whole of the UK. And we have our annual Great North Wood Festival, although there's some question about whether it will take place this year. But in fact, I think we're thinking of doing as the Urban Tree Festival has done and moving it online. So keep an eye out for that later in the year. But this is our festival last year at Sparwood, which was very successful. And then we've also been doing some tree planting. So in some of the sort of amenity grassland areas between the woodland sites, to sort of extend the area of woodland and to hopefully build resilience and connectivity in the landscape as a whole. So this is Norwood Park, where we did some tree planting in 2018. And I went and had a look at it yesterday actually, and it's looking pretty good. Most of the trees are alive, which is good. And that about brings me to the end of the presentation. But yeah, so the Great North Wood project is sadly coming to an end next year in May. Sadly, not least because me and Chantal will be out of a job. But of course, there's plenty of work to be still done in the Great North Wood. So we're sort of looking at potentials to continue the project in various ways, although now in the current landscape of funding, it might be quite tricky. But we have faith in the local councils have been very involved in the project, and I think we've sort of inspired them to value the woods more and to sort of see the woods as a whole and to look across borough boundaries. So I should have mentioned maybe that the Great North Wood covers 5 boroughs, so we've worked with 5 boroughs across that area. There's also several fantastic friends groups that do a lot of great work bringing the community into the woods and doing management works themselves. And we'll be creating a document called the Great North Wood Management Toolkit, which will be a sort of collection of all of the things we've learned about the Great North Wood in the last 4 or 5 years, and sort of thinking forward to how we might manage the Great North Wood in continuation. So that's one of the sort of hopefully legacies of the project. So how can you get involved? You can become a volunteer with us. So if you're interested in volunteering, or if you're not already a volunteer, drop us a line at greatnorthwood@wildlondon.org.uk, and we can send you some more information. We're clearly not doing volunteering right now, but we have weekly volunteer newsletters, and we'll let you know as soon as we are able to continue with our volunteering. We also have a big program of events in normal times. So if you want to be added to our events mailing list, again, you can drop us a line at that email address, or you can just look on our website at what events we've got coming up. You can follow us on Twitter at Great North Wood, or on Facebook at The Great North Wood. And you can also support the work that London Wildlife Trust does by becoming a member of London Wildlife Trust. And that will support the work that we do across the whole of London. So thank you very much. I'll hand over to Chantal, I think, and maybe she can see if there's any questions that she can answer or that she can pass on to me. Oh, you're muted.
I think me and Andrew are having a battle of muting here. Thanks, Sam, that was absolutely brilliant. Yeah, so if anyone wants to put any questions in the chat, I'm sort of trying to type away. I know Dave's just asked what the difference is between veteran trees and ancient trees, and I was just writing that ancient trees are, in a nutshell, so please, if anyone's got a better definition, ancient trees are trees that are remarkably old for their age, and veteran trees can also be ancient trees, but veteran trees have veteran features such as hollows and missing branches, and they're brilliant for wildlife. We've got a question here. Is the London Wildlife Trust involved in the latest plans for the regeneration of Crystal Palace Park that are currently open for public viewing? That's from Naomi.
Yeah, we've just been looking at this actually. Our Director of Conservation, Matthew Frith, is taking a look at the plans. I also took a look at them and sort of tried to make some sense of what's taking place. But Matthew Frith will be coming up with a sort of official response from the trust. Yeah, I think our main concern with the development is the loss of the scrub at the very top of the site, which we know is quite important for migratory birds. And we've had birds like lesser whitethroat nesting there. So yeah, we're quite keen to try and see that protected in any kind of developments there. So we'll be making that sort of known.
Brilliant. If anyone does want to ask a question with their voice, you can do the use raise your hand feature, which I think if you sort of see, I think it's in reactions, or if you want to do a reaction, which is a thumbs up. But if not, I'll, if you're happy for me to read your questions, I'll carry on doing that. Okay.
We've unmuted most of you, so you know, do wave at hands or ask a question, and we.
Okay, we have a question from Mark. Is there any of the old wood still left that is privately owned? Sam mentioned that councils bought a lot of land back for public use. I wondered if any wasn't bought and what wasn't developed on. Sorry.
Chantal, you've got Teresa Hardwick with her hand up in the air. Sorry, Teresa Hederick, I beg your pardon.
One of our lovely volunteers, Teresa.
It's all right, I'm asking a question. Thank you. Well corrected on my name. Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to wait until that question's answered, but for me, I know about kind of the main species of the trees in the Great North Wood, but, you know, listening to the talk again, it's made me think about, were there other species of trees that historically would have been in the wood in terms of, and, you know, are there ways we can kind of like increase the biodiversity of it if we are lacking trees?
Okay, thanks. I'll ask the previous question.
Yeah.
I'll answer the previous question first. So in terms of, yeah, there is some private land. So Dulwich Wood is owned by Dulwich Estate, which is a private organisation, although it is publicly accessible, most of it. And then I mentioned also Convent Wood, which is owned by Virgo Fidelis School, and that one's not publicly accessible. But all the others, I believe, are publicly accessible and sort of and publicly owned. And then, Teresa, so there's trees that are pretty rare now across the Great Northwood area, or perhaps not present at all. So like small-leaved lime, which sort of interestingly would have been dominant at a much earlier age of kind of woodland history. So we think that once woodland had colonized much of the UK, or to the extent that it had, perhaps it was a more open environment with, you know, like I said, with scrub and grassland and trees. But we think that small-leaved lime would have been a very much more dominant tree at that time, sort of before humans started to change the species content of the woodland. Wild service tree is another tree that perhaps has always been pretty rare in woodland. So we actually planted some of those in Norwood Park and in Upper Norwood Rec. We've also planted some small-leaved lime. We planted some of those in Sparwood. And we planted some sort of the more understory type trees like Gelder Rose and Hazel, where in areas of the wood where we find it lacking to some extent. So yeah, we've done a bit of tree planting, but we tend to favour natural regeneration where we can. So we're sort of more about setting the conditions where the trees that are there might naturally regenerate, to sort of, yeah, allow those processes to take place as naturally as possible.
Sam, we've got a gentleman with a beard holding his hand up. I think his hand is going to go lame or you know, fall off in a minute. So, but I don't know who he is, so I can't see his name. But
Paul.
with your hand up.
Paul.
Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah, I was wondering. Sorry to hear that the program will be ending, and I'm wondering the areas where you're reopening the sort of pasture bit of the wood pasture, how that will be continue to be managed, and also how you stop that just reverting very quickly to brambles. So how you kind of manage that, regrowth. Really, you mentioned the bluebells, but of course they'll quickly get swamped by other things like bramble, I suppose, is what first comes to mind, and how you're dealing with that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. In terms of, the picture I showed you of the project where we'd done some coppicing and fencing was big in wood, and there's a very active friends group there. Mike Avisa from Croydon Council is also fantastic and works with someone called Simon Levy, which is their sort of woodland advisor. So there are people around which are sort of able to monitor that and sort of hopefully maintain it to some extent. I mean, there's also the argument that it shouldn't need too much maintenance. But your point about bramble is good, or is an important one. Yeah, where you allow light down to the woodland floor, you tend to get bramble proliferating. And often where there's sort of partial shade, bramble doesn't grow too strongly. And even where it does grow strongly, ultimately you get young trees coming through that. Historically, plants like bramble and hawthorn and blackthorn, they've been called the mother of oak. So they would actually, where there was grazing mammals, they would actually protect the young oak seedlings in that sort of thorny mass, and they'd gradually be able to come up through it. So yeah, no, it's an interesting point, and it could be that the balance falls too far towards bramble and nothing else. But yeah, I suppose it's kind of experimental, and yeah, unfortunately we don't have the long term to be able to monitor it via this project. But I don't know, that probably hasn't answered your question completely satisfactorily, but
it does, it's a discussion and a thing to be thinking about, clearly, isn't it? It's a shame you can't reintroduce pannage and get pigs in there.
Yeah. Although they probably eat all the bluebell bulbs.
Yeah, that's true.
We've got another question from, where have I just seen it? From James Powell. It says, have the rewilding principles you mentioned at the start of your talk, NEP, etc., had an impact on how you manage your forests in an urban setting?
That's a really good question. I mean, as we just jokingly mentioned, the idea of bringing back pigs is not particularly feasible, or any kind of livestock in the woods that are the scale and sort of as highly visited as the woods that we work in. I suppose my thinking around woodland conservation has been definitely influenced by places like NEP, in turn, and sort of thinking about, like I mentioned, the idea that this sort of dense, dark woodland is potentially quite an artificial, or at least sort of unusual situation. So, a long time ago, before humans really got involved, the large animals would have maintained a much more open area. And then when humans were intensively managing the woods, they would have been coppicing and basically more or less clear felling the woods, apart from these standard trees for timber, on a 10-year rotation. So the woods would be much more open, and that process would allow trees that like oak that don't regenerate very well under a closed canopy, and allow those seedlings to come through. So it's kind of influenced the way I think about woodland in terms of.
Let me just refresh your memories in case.
Like more open woodland is definitely, in some ways, functions ecologically in ways that closed woodland doesn't. But unfortunately, we can't bring back any aurochs to the Great North Wood at this point.
We had quite a few mentions of Stambourne Woods, got quite a few fans, and Bethan's asked if it was considered part of the Great North Wood and has it been included in the project so far?
That's a good question. It's definitely part of the Great North Wood, yeah. It's even got a bit of ancient character in that it's got some sweet woodruff, a nice patch of sweet woodruff going by the path, which may have been planted, but it may have hung on, so that sort of the Stambourne Woodland Walk falls at the back of 2 rows of Victorian gardens, so it's a chance that sort of some ancient woodland might have survived in that fragment. And it was one of the woods that we considered at the beginning of the project for one of our key sites. In the end, we focused on sites that were a bit bigger. We had to sort of whittle it down, and it was quite difficult to kind of had to be quite brutal in which sites we didn't choose. We've had a bit of engagement with the Friends of Stambourne Wood, and we'd like to, we did a guided walk with them a couple of times, and we've sort of talked to them a little bit about how they're managing the woods, sort of, but they're doing a pretty good job, and they're quite an active friends group, but we could potentially work with them again, although there's not that much of the project left, and who knows when we'll be able to resume activities, but yeah.
Okay, I've got another question from, oh, it's just gone down, from Pip, who said, great talk. When did the term Great North Wood start to be used?
That's a good question. I was just thinking, it's kind of one that I haven't really worked out. I was just thinking about it today. I came across a map from, I think, the 1500s that had Norwood written on it, on an area of trees in the correct area. So the term sort of Northwood or Norwood is very old. Great Northwood, I'm not entirely sure when. I think that's a slightly more modern usage, perhaps sort of like 19th century. But yeah, it's a bit unclear about that.
And we've got Chris Schuler with his hand up, who's also a lovely, dedicated volunteer. If you want to, shall I unmute you, Chris?
Yes, please. Yeah. Yes, I've done a lot of research into the history of the woods. The term, it was called Norwood, which is where the suburb gets its name from, and Northwood, pretty interchangeably. It is, I think, the 16th century is the, if I remember rightly, is the earliest written reference to the Norwood or Northwood. The term Great Northwood only seems to come into being at the very end of the 19th century when a local historian called John Corbett Anderson self-published a book called The Great North Wood. But that is the earliest record I can find of the use of the term great. So it's a bit ironic. It's like the River Effra, which name was only sort of conjured up in the 19th century. These features only got their sort of present names just as they were disappearing.
Hey, folks, we're just getting to, we're closing around towards the end of the event. Sam and Chantel asked me whether we could run on for a few minutes longer. We're happy to do that if there are more questions. So we'll sort of run this till about 7:10. But if anyone needs to leave straight away, please do. You just can leave the meeting. It's great to have so many people involved. We'd love to have more questions and answer more. Just to say that the tour has been recorded and will continue. The recording will continue until about 7:10, and it will be uploaded on our YouTube channel. So if you've got friends or colleagues who weren't able to get in and would have liked to have come, then please pass them on the YouTube channel, which is in the chat. And then I also just want to quickly say that we have an absolutely packed weekend program of different events, starting with a meditation first thing tomorrow morning, and going right through the day. We've replanned and rescheduled the Living with Trees seminar that we lost to Zoom last Sunday, and that's going to be run again Saturday evening. We've got a repeat of the Ancient Tree Tour, which was so popular earlier in the week. That's coming out at noon. But we also have Enriching with the Elder event. We had a workshop with Healing the Hawthorn with Hannah Sylvester this afternoon. It was incredibly popular. So that's Enriching with the Elder. So there's lots happening tomorrow, and there's even more happening on Sunday. And we have quite a lot of people. We've got 25 authors and poets taking part, and some of them are conservation volunteers as well in our Write About Trees showcase. So please, I'll just post the At a Glance program for everyone again. Please sign up and join up other events, and we'll run this tour for another 10 minutes to take more questions. Thanks very much. Right, next question over to you, Chantal. You're in charge.
Over to
I just wanted to thank Chris there for that input, which is very interesting. And just to say that Chris is a local historian that's created a fantastic video about, it's called Mapping the Great North Wood. So if you're interested in sort of looking in more depth at the history of the Great North Wood, and particularly its sort of extent and how that changed over time and was gradually diminished, he's got a very a very interesting video about that. So I'll just post that in the chat now. I know Chantal already did, but I'll just have I done that privately somehow? So let me just change that while I work out how to do this. Chantal, if you want to take another question.
Sure. So Stella Wisdom has asked, being a library nerd, I'd be interested in which books and manuscripts some of the historic illustrations came from.
Just the internet. Which ones are we thinking of?
Should I talk? Can you hear me? When I was looking at some of the manuscripts and some of the, my confession is I work at the British Library and I'm a curator there, and I was looking at some of these illustrations from books and things thinking, oh, and I got a bit excited, wondering if some of them actually might be from things that we've got in the collections that I've got, and obviously I'm not allowed in the building at the moment, and none of my colleagues apart from security staff are, but I was thinking especially the Queen of the Gypsies and some of these kind of lovely book illustrations, and I've forgotten the name. What's the name of the ancestor cow that you were telling us
the
about?
aurochs,
the aurochs. So that wonderful kind of medieval looking drawing of the aurochs and things. And I was just kind of wondering which manuscripts and books these might have come from. Happy for me to do some looking later, but I was taking some kind of screenshots of your presentation. Okay. But yeah, they were great.
Thanks for that. I don't know. I don't know much about the sort of sources of those imagery. Apart from that, I just found them on Wikimedia Commons and sort of look into really. So I was just raiding the sort of copyright-free images on Wikimedia Commons without paying too much attention to.
No, we love Wikimedia Commons. Wearing other hats, I do my best to try and add some British Library images to Wikimedia Commons. So yeah, that's not a bad place to raid for images at all.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, we have a question from Becky. What's the biggest immediate threat to any remaining woodland? Is it council selling off land or something else, to the best of your knowledge?
That's another great question. So council selling off land. I mean, a lot of the Great North Wood sites, maybe even partly because of our project, but sort of they already were highly valued by local people. And when I think that we're sort of potentially past the era when councils are able to sell off bits of the land or bits of the woodland. I suppose there's sort of areas around the woodland which could be developed and which could impact on the woodlands in some way. But the woodlands themselves, particularly the ancient woodlands, are fairly safe from development. I think so. There were other threats, like just although we really recognise that people visiting the woods is a fantastic thing. The fact that they are such small woodlands means that the visitor pressure on them is quite intense. Particularly actually during lockdown, we've seen paths widening, and you often have these very fragile communities of plants right on the edge of the path. I think it's, you know, it's to do with people trying to social distance, as well as just a lot more people going to the woods. And yeah, just the sheer number of footfall, and also dogs. You know, it would be great. I'd ask everyone that has a dog, if visiting the woodlands, you could have your dog on a lead, so that nesting birds that nest sort of low down, things like wrens and blackbirds and blackcap and chiffchaff, aren't disturbed by dogs that are sort of running through undergrowth. Yeah, I think that's probably one of the main threats, actually, is just sort of trampling, people sort of leaving the paths as well, and the woods are kind of more fragile than you might think in that way.
Okay, and then one from David Carey. How can you encourage older trees with features while avoiding safety concerns, misplaced or not? And how do you retain deadwood from foragers with wood stoves?
In terms of, there is often a conflict to some extent between sort of tree safety and maintaining trees with veteran features. I think arborists are getting better at recognizing that deadwood is really important. So we've seen a few big trees that have come down in the Great North Wood, like there's one at Streatham Common, which has just been left. So it's dead and it's fallen over, so it's not going to fall any further. But I think once upon a time that would be tidied up. But we're seeing now that arborists are kind of valuing that deadwood habitat. And in terms of living trees that are potentially going to fall down, you know, safety does have to come first. If there's a potential to move the path that the tree might be underneath, then maybe that would be a good thing to do, because obviously the trees have been there for many centuries before the path was even there potentially. But that might not be the case. But often trees can be reduced to make them more stable, or if they're dead, they can be turned into monoliths. So that's when you cut all the branches off and you've just got a big sort of pillar of a tree, which is still very useful for all kinds of invertebrates and woodpeckers and things. Don't know if that answers the question at all.
Shall we have one more question, and then I think we better bring it to an end. So who's going to be? Chantal, you pick the lucky person.
I think we've actually answered all the questions in the chat. I'm not sure if anyone else has got a... Oh, here we are. James Powell at the last minute. I know that councils' local plans are talking about linking green spaces into larger territories alongside a national nature recovery network. What are the possibilities for connecting together these wood remnants?
So I showed that slide of us planting some trees in Norwood Park. And we've also done some tree planting in Upper Norwood Recreation Ground, which is nearby. And those parks are they lie between several of the Great North Wood sites. So sort of between Convent Wood and some of the sites in Croydon, like Biggin Wood, and sort of Dulwich Wood, I guess. So by creating these sort of little islands of woodland in what was amenity grassland, that it does to some extent increase the connectivity of the woods. Connecting them sort of fully, as in sort of so that they are fully connected, is quite a difficult thing to do, or perhaps impossible, because just of the sheer number of roads and houses in between. There's not much we can do about that. But where there are areas for tree planting is sort of in areas of amenity grassland that are underused. So you know, they're not necessarily a playing pitch, but so why not plant trees on them?
Great. Okay, folks, we're going to call it today. A big round of applause, I think, for Sam, especially. He's talked himself also, but also to Chantal, and obviously to the London Wildlife Trust, who put this together and have been looking after the Great North Wood for us. We would have loved to have done those walks through the woods with them, but alas, we're all online. But we hope to see you over the weekend. Come and join in. Lots of talks and events. And please support the Urban Tree Festival if you can. I know many of you on this call have already done so, so thank you very much to you as well. I'm going to end the meeting now.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Brilliant.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thanks for participating.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.